Hello watch enthusiasts. Now today I'd like to talk about wristwatches which are very famous for being seen in movies. And in this video I'd like to make my top 5 of the most famous watches in films. Now of course this list is only my opinion, and do please include any watches which you think should have been included or are also very important in films down below. Now the first watch which I'd like to talk about is the Seiko 6105, which was famously worn by Martin Sheen, i.e. Captain Willard, in Apocalypse Now. And is one of those watches which is actually very historically accurate, considering the basis and the context for the film. Now, Seiko 6105s were dive watches, 150-meter dive watches made by Seiko, with painted unidirectional bezels and highly legible loomed hands. And these were often worn by soldiers in Vietnam, and this was due to the fact they were very reliable, very rugged, and of course, easily serviced. Now the reason that people wore these, apart from the fact that these watches were very rugged, was the fact that the army-issued wristwatches were unreliable and tended to leak and fog up in the jungle, humid environments they were fighting in. Equally, the Seikos were easier to service in that their movements were more general, more known to more watchmakers. Of course, an interesting thing about this watch is that compared to a modern SKX, these watches were actually hacking, which is again a major feature when one's at war, so one can synchronise wristwatches, and then again that bezel adds a certain level of timing functionality. This watch is also worn on a waffle-style rubber strap in this film, which is also something very typical of these watches because the rubber straps made for the watch were often seen as the most comfortable used for this 41mm case, and were equally very very rugged even, and offered a certain durability that even a bracelet couldn't match, where bars and so on could break, whereas with a rubber strap there really was very little to go wrong. Now all of these points come together, in my opinion, in order to show what a good choice of watch this was for the character and indeed for the setting, for Vietnam, during the war. And equally it showed an attention to detail with regards to the actual watches worn by soldiers of the time, which is something which often isn't seen in films. They simply bung on any watch that looks vaguely military, without really considering what watch actually would have been worn by the particular soldiers. And this really does make this watch a real icon, and definitely gives it a place on my list. Now this next watch on the list is also a Seiko, and it's the Giugiaro 7A28-7000, worn by Ripley in Aliens. Now of course Aliens has collected a real cult following as the sequel to Alien, and whereas the original Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, was a real move into a type of horror, sci-fi sort of film, and has become memorable to many people because of its particular features of the alien, of having no one ever really seen something of that type before. James Cameron's sequel, Aliens, takes on a much more action film type of style. Now 2 of these watches are actually included in the film, a black PVD one and a normal stainless steel version. Now Ripley, the key character, the protagonist if you will, wears the non-PVD stainless steel one, with that bead-blasted finish and that very interesting bracelet. Of course, this was one of the first quartz chronographs. It was one of the early generation Seiko chronographs, and had a very particular design, designed by the designer Giugiaro, making it a very, very memorable watch, and also quite an expensive one, considering it has a quartz movement for around £1,000 these days, and usually they're in pretty bad condition too. Now the dial design, which has been segmented into a lower section with the sub-dials, and then a higher level with the main print and Seiko on it, this has inspired a lot of watches since, and really has become a design icon and a design classic really, with that integrated bracelet and quite simple case design contrasted by those very different pushers. Now Seiko have even produced a limited edition version of this watch more recently, in order to commemorate the original design of this watch, which really is a testament to what an icon this watch is. Now this next watch is of course part of a major franchise, which is the James Bond movies, and this is the Seamaster 300M, worn by Pierce Brosnan and then briefly by Daniel Craig. Now this watch was of course worn in the various 90s Bond movies, in that blue dial and blue bezel guise, which has really shaped the way people see the 300, and has equally made this watch a real icon, and this is proven by the fact the design has barely changed in 20 years. And of course, the makeup of this watch is a 300-metre diver with a helium release valve, and a date, and also that proprietary bracelet, which looks fantastic on this watch and really is typical of this particular watch design, the Seamaster 300M. But equally, this watch started out life in the earlier 90s films with a quartz movement, but quickly became the automatic, which everyone knows the Bond watch as being. Now, I think the reason for this watch is such, immense success, and the fact that many people know it as being a Bond watch, is the fact that this was the first sort of Swiss major brand which directly sponsored a Bond film. So they directly included the Seamaster in publicity and so on as the Bond watch, whereas Rolex, for example, with the Submariner, never endorsed the Bond franchise, and was never actually named in the films properly. It was shown, of course, but never named, whereas one actually saw the Seamaster on a lot of Bond publicity. Now, of course, Omega have launched a new 300 to accompany Spectre, which is the new Bond film, or at least the most recent, which includes various vintage design choices, I suppose, because of the layout of the dial and the broad arrow hands. Equally, that lollipop style second hand is a nice choice, and the GMT bezel is also very different and differs greatly from previous dive watches worn by Bond. However, this watch hasn't really yet reached the cult status that the 300M has acquired, but maybe in time, if this watch is continued to be used in the franchise, maybe it will. Now, of course, the next watch is the Heuer Monaco Caliber 11, worn by Steve McQueen in the movie Le Mans, and this has really become an icon in the racing world, possibly even more so than the Rolex Daytona, because it has these bold lines which look extremely individual, and really no one would assume that a Monaco was anything but a Monaco. Now, this watch, with its square design and those two white subdials, is actually very legible. Now, people say it's very complicated in terms of its dial design, but actually it's very legible because it has that simple bicompax look and display. Now, contrary to what a lot of people sometimes say, the watch worn in the film was actually a Caliber 11, with the crown on the left-hand side of the case and then the pushers on the right, as opposed to the version which has all of the setting features, such as the crown and the pushers, on the right-hand side of the case. And this makes perfect sense, because in a race you don't want to mess around with the crown and the timekeeping of the watch, but rather engage and disengage the chronograph to time your laps. In my opinion, this watch has also become iconic because its design is very typical of the era. It has those blues and those creams and those reds, which are all colours which one doesn't tend to see in those soft shades these days. Now, of course, this watch also suited the Gulf liveried Porsche 917K driven in this film, which is a really gorgeous car, and I shan't get into that though because I suppose it's off topic, but it's a beautiful car and really does match the Heuer because of its new and modern lines, which again the Heuer had compared to other watches of the era, such as, for example, a Daytona, which had a very classic, very traditionally acceptable design, which I love as well, but this really did show a leap into the future. Ironically, these days, these watches don't really show a leap into the future, but rather a leap into the past, which I suppose shows a certain irony to the design. Now, finally, I have to include the Rolex Submariner. It's such an icon, and mostly known for its appearance in Sean Connery's Bond movies, as this original late 50s or early 60s version of the Submariner, with that large crown and no crown guards. Now, the 6538, which was the version of the Submariner worn by Sean Connery in the Bond films, had, as one knows, that large crown, which has become a really iconic design, and something which one hasn't seen on Rolex Submariners since then, after crown guards were implemented. And I think that actually one does see a certain elegance to not having crown guards, despite the fact that they are very functional features to have. Of course, this watch is also known for being worn on that 16mm NATO strap, as opposed to the 20mm, which this watch actually was, because apparently they couldn't find a strap that was the correct width, and the bracelet on the watch, because it didn't belong to Connery, didn't fit him. So as a result, they had to improvise. And of course, that striped green, red, and black strap has become extremely famous as the Bond strap. Now, the grey and black version has also become famous, but until Spectre was never actually worn by Bond, so this is the true Bond strap. Now, in my opinion, these older Submariners had a certain elegance that modern ones simply don't. And this is no criticism of the modern watch, because I love the modern watch as well. But with that narrow bezel, that very simple dial without anything that's superfluous, these watches make for very elegant watches to be worn both as sports watches and possibly even dress watches, because of their classic elegance. That off-white cream colour of the lume also adds a wonderful vintage look to this watch. And of course, the Rolex Submariner did reappear on the wrist of Roger Moore in Live and Let Die. But of course, this was a later version with crown guards, and it was on the bracelet. The reference of this watch was the 5513, and also had a larger style of lug even, which made for a thicker, more masculine sort of watch, I suppose. Despite the fact that I love the original, this watch really did show a move into the future for Submariners. Of course, this watch is also just as well known for its sheer magnetism, and its cutting bezel, which would spin at very high speeds, when of course the markers went red. And this is an interesting touch, because in the latest Spectre 007 film, one sees the Seamaster 300's numbers and indices go red before it blows up in the film. Whereas here, the Submariner's dial markers also go red, which does also show a certain level of I wouldn't call it copying, but inspiration in the Bond franchise. Anyway, I'll end on a picture of that beautiful 5538 Rolex. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please do like, share and subscribe, because it really does mean the world to this channel and will allow you to see more content on this channel. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.